Hello and welcome to another episode of The Living Philosophy. Today I want to talk a little bit about my favourite ancient philosopher, and it's a guy called Heraclitus. He's known as the philosopher of riddles, and all we actually have left from him is a collection of scraps of sayings from other philosophers and other thinkers in the ancient world. He wrote a book of cryptic little, seemed like almost aphoristic cryptic sayings that went together, and a lot of people in the ancient world couldn't make heads or tails of it, and this is why he's known as the philosopher of riddles. But he's got some very fascinating insights. There's like really rich things. It's quite like reading Nietzsche, and maybe a big inspiration for Nietzsche. I know Heraclitus is Nietzsche's favorite ancient philosopher as well, and if you dig down into Heraclitus, there's some almost paradoxical things. So the way that Heraclitus is generally portrayed is as saying, the standard simplified narrative is that Heraclitus believed that fire was the fundamental element, and that the nature of everything is change, constant change, and panta, so eternal change, and you can't step into the same river twice. That's Heraclitus, if you've ever heard that saying before. And it just means that by the time you step in this river, you can't step in it again because all that water has flowed on, and so you step in a completely different river every time. And so Heraclitus is emphasizing the complete nature of permanent change, and that's how he's generally portrayed. The portrayal of him as being seeing the fundamental element as fire. That's like an old Aristotelian idea where Aristotle took everyone before Socrates and he pinned them down to their single greatest idea. So he just created this narrative that, Thales believed that the nature of the world was water, and Anaximander believed it was nous, mind, and Heraclitus believed it was fire. So just simplified it into this thing as if they were all talking about the same thing but had different perspectives. And Aristotle kind of dismissed them as fools, as poor, as half-baked philosophers. And it's amazing how much that idea has kind of held on. Like even when I was getting taught about the Presocratic philosophers in university, it's still, 2,400 years later, it's still the same thing of like, so Thales believed the fundamental element was water. And it just shows, for me, it just shows a complete lack of nuance and of any real interaction with these thinkers. And it's a shame, really, because I think that there's a wealth of knowledge there. The only one that ever tends to get some serious philosophical reflection is Parmenides. And see that Parmenides and Heraclitus are actually very similar. So Parmenides' main doctrine is this idea that he creates this fantastic poetic argument, and we just have a bit of it now, but that it shows that everything is one. Everything, there's no other way for anything to be anything but one, and everything, any distinction that you make, it just shows it's all just an illusion, and that everything is ultimately all this one thing. And so Heraclitus and Parmenides are often contrasted, as if Heraclitus is saying everything is change and Parmenides is saying everything is one. But it's actually, it's not that clean cut. So there's two parts to Parmenides' book. The first is about being and the second is becoming. So the first is this thing of how everything is one. And then the second half of the book, we've only got little snippets of it, but it's this bizarre thing. It's not the opposite, but it's the nature of the 10,000 things, to put it in a kind of a Taoist kind of formulation. But it's how it's okay, so everything in reality is one, but let's look at how things appear. And that's kind of what the second half of Parmenides' book is about. Heraclitus is actually very similar. So we have it from an ancient source that the first quote, the first part in Heraclitus' book is about this thing called the Logos. And the Logos, this was a big influence on Plato and on Christianity. If you think of the first line of the book of John, that, that Jesus was the Word and that the Word was with God before there was anything. And this word in that passage is Logos. The Greek word is Logos there. And that history kind of comes back to Heraclitus' sense. Because in the first passage of his book, he says, "It is wise agreeing not with me, but with the Logos, that all things are one." And there's a few different ways in which he says that at the very beginning, but his thing is that all things are one. The Logos is this one thing. And yet he's represented as just believing in panta, And so I believe that there's room for much more investigation and discernment when it comes to Heraclitus, this philosopher of riddles, and that the idea that he just believed that fire was a thing, was the fundamental element, and that all things are just constantly changing. While it's true that he believed that, he also believed the exact opposite, that all things are one. And so did Parmenides. I guess it's just another example of when we're being uncautious and it's convenient to, when first approaching a subject, to create these big buckets in which we throw. Okay, so a good way of understanding the Presocratics is each of them thought that the nature of reality was one thing. He thought it was fire, he thought it was mind, he thought it was water. And it's just this way of generalizing things where we don't want to. It's a first way of understanding it. But the thing is that like so much of philosophy has evolved out of Plato, but we could have just put Plato in that bucket and said, because he honoured the good was the fundamental thing. So you could put Plato in that bucket as well and say, well, that was all Plato thought. And it would just be such an injustice to discard someone like that. And so, yeah, it's a sign of intellectual laziness, I guess. And I just wanted to correct a little bit of that with Heraclitus here by showing that, you know, in these ancient thinkers especially, they can be so paradoxical and they can be the exact opposite of what they seem to be. And yet still be the thing they seem to be. He's both panta and he's logos. He's the everything and the one thing. And I guess it's the warning of Lao Tzu is quite relevant here. So in the first passage of the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu says that the Tao that can be spoken is not the real Tao. And that's immediately just undermining everything he can say in the rest of the book, because he's putting it in words. And it's becoming something spoken, but it's already lost that essence. And I think it's the same mysterious riddle that both Heraclitus and Parmenides are trying to encapsulate. They're both trying to say that the nature of reality is fundamentally paradoxical, and so they both end up talking about how reality is this one thing and how it's many things. And it seems contradictory, but then if we remember those words of Lao Tzu, that the Tao that can be spoken is not the real Tao, then we remember that the nature of reality seems to be paradoxical. That's what's coming to us from the mystics. And yeah, it's just a really interesting thing. So I hope you've enjoyed that little bit of ancient philosophy. And if you have, please subscribe if you haven't already. And otherwise, I shall see you next time. Thanks for watching.